My daughter-in-law told me she'd put down my husband's dog. 10 days later, I found him alive in my backyard, digging up evidence that would send her and my own son to prison. My name is Barbara Whitfield. I'm 73 years old, and after 34 years practicing tax law, I thought I'd seen every kind of deception. I was wrong. The worst betrayal came from my own family, wrapped in false sympathy, delivered 3 days after I buried my husband of 47 years. James died of pancreatic cancer this past March. The disease took him in 6 brutal months, but through it all, one constant remained: his golden retriever, Cooper. That 9-year-old dog had been James's shadow since 2015. Through every chemo session, every bad night, every moment when the pain made my husband forget his own name, Cooper was there. Paws on the floor beside the hospital bed, head resting on James's feet, waiting. When James finally let go, I was shattered. My son Eric and his wife Natalie arrived the day after, claiming they'd come to help. But Natalie had other plans. Cooper was grieving too, searching every room for James, whimpering at closed doors, and Natalie wouldn't stop complaining. The dog was dirty, shedding everywhere. Too much for a woman my age to handle alone. She'd take care of it. 3 days after we buried James, Natalie made her announcement. She'd taken Cooper to the vet that morning. He'd been suffering, she said. It was more humane this way. It was already done. I'd just lost my husband. Now his dog, the last living piece of James I had left, was gone too. Or so I thought. But Cooper had other ideas. And so, apparently, had James. Are you ready to hear how a dog that traveled 40 miles home exposed a $160,000 fraud? Hit that subscribe button, because this story gets darker before it gets lighter, and you won't believe what that dog dug up in my garden. I didn't sleep much that first week after Natalie's announcement. The house felt wrong without Cooper's nails clicking on the hardwood, without his soft breathing from the corner of the bedroom where James used to let him sleep. Every morning, I woke up forgetting, just for a second, that they were both gone. Then, reality would crash back, and I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, wondering how I was supposed to keep living in a world without either of them. Eric called every few days, his voice tight with what I thought was shared grief. He'd ask if I needed anything, if I was eating, if I'd thought about selling the house. That last question came up more than once. The house was too big for me now, he'd say. Too many memories. Maybe I should think about something smaller, closer to them. I told him I wasn't ready. This was the house where James and I raised him, where we'd celebrated 47 Christmases, where James had planted those roses in the backyard because I'd mentioned once, decades ago, that I loved them. I wasn't abandoning it. Natalie had been strangely quiet after her announcement about Cooper. She didn't call, didn't visit. When I saw her at Eric's side during one of his check-ins, she stayed in the car, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, even though it was overcast. I should have known something was wrong then. But grief makes you stupid. It makes you accept things you'd normally question, simply because you don't have the energy to fight. That changed on a Thursday morning, exactly 10 days after Natalie claimed she'd had Cooper put down. I woke up at 6 to a sound I knew but couldn't place, a rhythmic scratching, like claws on dirt. For a moment, still half asleep, I thought James was in the garden. He'd always been an early riser, tending to those roses before the sun got too hot. Then I remembered. James was gone, and so was his dog. But the sound continued. I got out of bed, my joints protesting the way they always did first thing in the morning, and walked to the bedroom window that overlooked the backyard. The early light was gray and soft, mist still clinging to the grass. And there, by James's rose bushes, was Cooper. I thought I was hallucinating. Grief does that too. Makes you see things that aren't there. Conjures the faces and shapes of what you've lost. I gripped the windowsill, blinking hard, waiting for the vision to dissolve. Cooper kept digging. I ran. At 73, With a knee that's needed replacing for 5 years, I ran through the house and out the back door in my nightgown and bare feet. The wet grass soaked my ankles. The morning air bit at my skin. None of it mattered. Cooper! Cooper! The dog's head snapped up. His golden coat was matted and filthy, caked with mud and something darker. He'd lost weight. I could see his ribs beneath the fur. But his eyes were clear and focused, and when he saw me, he barked once, sharp, urgent. Then he went right back to digging. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands reaching out to touch him, to prove he was real. His fur was damp and smelled like earth and rot, but he was solid and warm and alive. Tears came so fast I couldn't see. I wrapped my arms around him, and he let me, but only for a moment before he pulled away and returned to his frantic excavation. "What are you doing, boy? What's down there?" Cooper had torn up a section of ground about 2 feet wide, right at the base of James's favorite rose bush, the deep red one he'd named Barbara's Bloom as a joke, because I'd always been more thorns than petals, he said. The hole was already 8 inches deep, and Cooper showed no signs of stopping. Something in his intensity made me pay attention. This wasn't random digging. This was purposeful, determined. James used to say Cooper was smarter than half the people he'd worked with in his engineering firm. Watching the dog now, I believed it. I went back inside, grabbed a garden spade from the garage, and returned to help. My back would hate me later, but I didn't care. Cooper moved aside as I started digging, his eyes tracking every movement, his tail wagging just slightly when I hit something solid. A metal box. Military green, about the size of a shoebox, sealed with weatherproof tape. My hands shook as I pulled it from the dirt. Cooper sat back on his haunches, panting, watching me with an expression that looked almost expectant. Inside the house, at the kitchen table with Cooper lying at my feet, drinking from his old water bowl like he'd never left, I opened the box. An envelope with my name in James's handwriting, a flash drive, a stack of documents in plastic sleeves. I opened the letter first. James's hand had been shaky when he wrote it. This was from near the end, when the tremors had started. But the words were clear. "Barbara, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and something's made you look. I trained Cooper to show you where I buried this. I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I was too weak, and I didn't want to burden you while you were caring for me. But you need to know. Don't trust Eric and Natalie with any financial decisions. I discovered something about the firm's accounts. Evidence is on the drive. I documented everything. Cooper knows. That's why I trained him. He'll show you if you need to see. Protect yourself, my love. I'm sorry I couldn't do it myself. James." The paper crumpled slightly in my grip. I set it down carefully and picked up the flash drive with hands that had stopped shaking and started going numb. Cooper's head rested on my foot, his presence anchoring me as I carried the drive to James's old computer in his study, the room I hadn't entered since he died because it still smelled like his cologne. The files loaded slowly, spreadsheets, bank statements, email screenshots. And there, in columns of numbers that my tax attorney brain could read like plain English, was the truth. Over the last 2 years of James's life, Eric had transferred $160,000 out of the firm's operating account. Small amounts at first, $2,000 here, $3,000 there. Then bigger chunks as James got sicker, as he got less able to check the books himself. The transfers went to an account in Eric and Natalie's names. The authorization signatures were forged. I could see where Eric had traced James's signature, the slight wobble that James's real signature never had, even at the end. My son had robbed his dying father, and then his wife had tried to make my husband's dog disappear. I sat in that chair for an hour, reading every document James had compiled. He'd known for at least 3 months before he died. He'd been too sick to confront Eric, too weak to fight. So he'd done what any good engineer would do. He'd documented everything and created a failsafe. He'd trained Cooper to dig up the truth. The question that kept circling in my head was, where had Cooper been for 10 days? Natalie said she'd had him put down, but clearly that was a lie. So what had she actually done with him? And why had she wanted him gone so badly? I looked down at the dog sleeping at my feet, his body finally relaxed after what must have been an ordeal I couldn't imagine. Cooper had traveled back to this house from somewhere. He'd known exactly where to dig. He'd done what James trained him to do. My son and his wife had stolen from us. They'd lied about killing my husband's dog. And now I had proof of all of it, delivered by an animal they'd underestimated as much as they'd underestimated me. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed, Martin Hayes, my former law partner who'd moved into criminal defense after I retired. But before I called him, I needed to know one more thing. Where had Cooper been? And what else had they done that I hadn't discovered yet? Martin answered on the second ring. I heard the surprise in his voice when he realized it was me calling at 7 a.m. "Barbara, everything okay?" I looked at Cooper, still sleeping on the floor of James's study. "Martin, I need you to come over, and I need you to come as a criminal attorney, not as a friend." He was at my door within 40 minutes. I made coffee while he read through James's documents. When he finally looked up, his jaw was tight. "Barbara, this is systematic fraud. Eric forged your husband's signature dozens of times over 2 years. This isn't a family dispute. This is a felony." "I know." I refilled his cup, my hand steady now. "But there's more. Natalie told me she had Cooper put down 10 days ago, but Cooper showed up this morning and dug up that box. So where has he been?" Martin looked at the dog. "You think they tried to get rid of him?" "I think James trained him to show me where he buried the evidence. And I think Natalie wanted him gone before he could lead me here. That's animal cruelty at minimum." Martin pulled out his phone. "I know an investigator. If Cooper was somewhere for 10 days, we can find out where." While Martin made calls, I took Cooper to Dr. Santos's veterinary clinic. We'd been using Dr. Santos for 15 years. He'd sent a genuine sympathy card when James died, not generic sentiment. His receptionist's eyes widened when she saw Cooper. "Mrs. Whitfield? We heard." I thought. So did I. I kept my voice level. "I need to check your records for any visits from my daughter-in-law, Natalie Whitfield, in the past 2 weeks." Dr. Santos came out personally, his face registering shock. "Barbara, I don't understand. Your daughter-in-law called asking for Cooper's records last month, said you were transferring vets. But there was never any appointment here, and certainly no euthanasia procedure. She told me she brought him here, that he was suffering and she'd had him put down." Dr. Santos's expression darkened. "No, never. Cooper is your dog, registered in your name. Legally, she couldn't authorize that without your permission." He knelt down, examining Cooper. "He's dehydrated, lost about 8 pounds. These scrapes on his paws are fresh, a day or 2 old. He's been traveling hard." "Can you tell where he's been?" "He's been confined somewhere without adequate care. See this matting? That's from lying in his own waste. And this," he indicated Cooper's neck where the fur was rubbed raw. "This is from a collar or chain that was too tight." The image formed in my mind. Cooper trapped somewhere, pulling against restraints until he could break free. Then traveling back. But from where? Martin's investigator was a woman named Patricia Reeves, former detective, now in her 50s with sharp eyes and a directness I appreciated. She arrived that afternoon with a laptop. "Mrs. Whitfield, tell me everything Natalie said about taking Cooper. Exact words if you can remember." I walked her through it. The complaints, the announcement 3 days after the funeral, the way Eric had backed her up without quite looking at me. Patricia made notes, then examined Cooper, photographing his condition. She made several calls, speaking in law enforcement shorthand. When she finished, her expression was grim. There are only a handful of places within reasonable distance where someone could drop off a dog for cheap disposal. I'm checking rural kennels and gray market services. If Cooper made it back on his own, he couldn't have traveled more than 50 miles. She was back the next day. I was in the garden with Cooper when Patricia's car pulled up. Her face told me everything. There's a place called Dennis's Kennels, 43 miles northwest. Barely legal operation. Owner confirmed a woman matching Natalie's description brought in a golden retriever 11 days ago. Paid $200 cash for what she called humane disposal. My chest tightened. What did he do? Kept Cooper in a shed out back, fed him irregularly, kept him chained. Until 3 days ago, when Cooper broke the chain and escaped through a gap in the shed wall. 43 miles. Cooper had traveled 43 miles back to this house, to this garden, to the exact spot where James had trained him to dig. The owner's willing to testify, Patricia continued. He kept the intake form Natalie signed. Fake name, but he confirmed her photo. He's angry about being used. Martin stepped forward. Barbara, we have them. The financial fraud is documented. Now we have Natalie on record for animal cruelty and possibly obstruction, since Cooper was material evidence. I looked at Cooper, lying peacefully where James had planted roses and buried truth. The dog had survived abandonment, traveled impossible distance, and delivered exactly what James had trained him to deliver. They'd thought Cooper was just a dog to be eliminated. They'd thought I was just a grieving widow, too sad to ask questions. File everything, I told Martin. Criminal charges for both of them. And Martin? I want Cooper listed as material evidence. I want it on record that they tried to eliminate him because of what he knew. Patricia smiled. A dog as a witness. That'll make headlines. That night, I sat in James's study with Cooper at my feet. Some betrayals bury themselves deep. But if you're patient and trust the right allies, even the ones with 4 legs, truth digs its way back to the surface. Now I just had to make them face it. The hardest thing I've ever done wasn't burying my husband. It was calling my son 2 days after I found the evidence and pretending I knew nothing. I told Eric I'd been thinking about what he'd said, that maybe the house was too big, that I wanted to discuss my options. Could he and Natalie come for dinner Saturday? The eagerness in his voice made my stomach turn. He agreed immediately, suggesting they could help me start looking at senior communities. Some of them were really nice, he said. Senior communities. They wanted me warehoused somewhere small and manageable while they figured out what to do with James's assets, the ones they hadn't already stolen. I hung up and looked at Martin, who'd been listening on speaker. He asked if I was sure about this approach. I need to know if Eric was in on Natalie's plan with Cooper. The money, yes, that's documented. But did he know she was trying to eliminate evidence? Martin reminded me I didn't have to confront them alone. But I wasn't confronting anyone yet. I was playing the part they expected. A confused old widow who couldn't manage her own house. Cooper lifted his head from where he lay by the fireplace. I'd kept him hidden since his return. Curtains drawn when Eric called, careful not to mention him. As far as they knew, their plan had worked. Cooper would stay out of sight until the right moment. They thought he was gone. I intended to let them keep thinking it. The days until Saturday felt endless. I met with Martin and Patricia building our case. The financial evidence was solid. Eric's forgeries were obvious up close, the kind of thing that only works when nobody's looking. Patricia had statements from Dennis Kowalski, photos of the shed where Cooper had been kept, even receipts showing Natalie's cash payment. But I wanted more. I wanted to watch them lie to my face. I wanted to see how far they'd go. Saturday arrived cold and gray. I spent the afternoon cooking James's pot roast recipe, the one Eric had loved as a child. I set the table with our good china, the wedding set we'd received 47 years ago. I even put out the silver candlesticks James's mother had given us. I was staging a scene, a widow's desperate attempt at normalcy, a woman who needed her family. Cooper stayed in James's study with the door closed. Patricia was parked 2 blocks away with recording equipment. Maryland is a one-party consent state, and I'd be documenting everything. Martin waited at his office, ready to move when I gave the signal. They arrived at 6:15, Natalie carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She commented on how good the house smelled, how nice it was to see me taking care of myself. Eric hugged me, and I had to force myself not to pull away. Over dinner, they performed concern so well I almost believed it. Eric asked about my sleep, my appetite, whether I'd been keeping up with my doctor's appointments. Natalie mentioned a lovely assisted living facility just 20 minutes from their house. Independent living, she called it, but with support staff if I needed help. I played my role perfectly. I mentioned forgetting to pay a bill last week, having trouble keeping track of things. I said the house felt overwhelming now, all the maintenance James used to handle. Maybe they were right. Maybe I should think about something smaller. Eric's relief was visible. He started talking about putting the house on the market, how strong the real estate market was right now, how I could get a good price. The money could go into a trust, he suggested. He could manage it for me, make sure I was taken care of. Natalie agreed enthusiastically. It would be such a weight off my shoulders, she said. I could just relax and not worry about finances or property management. They'd handle everything. I asked about James's firm. Eric explained he'd been managing things since James got sick, keeping everything running. Business was good. Nothing to worry about there either. The lies rolled off his tongue so smoothly, I wondered how long he'd been practicing. Maybe years. Maybe our entire relationship had been built on whatever version of truth was convenient for him. Then Natalie made her mistake. She reached across the table and patted my hand, her voice taking on that syrupy tone people use with children and the elderly. She said she knew how hard it must have been losing Cooper on top of everything else, that it was a blessing, really. I wouldn't have been able to care for a dog anyway. It was better this way. I looked at her. This woman my son had married 8 years ago. This woman who'd smiled at James's funeral and plotted theft in the same breath. I let my eyes fill with tears and told her she was right, that I missed Cooper but understood it had been necessary. She squeezed my hand and assured me I'd made the right choice, trusting her judgment. Trusting her judgment. As if I'd had any say in what she'd done. Eric shifted the conversation back to the house. He had a realtor friend who could come by next week, give me an assessment. They could start clearing out James's things, make it easier for me. Maybe box up his clothes, his papers, all those files in his study. Those files, the ones that would show exactly what Eric had been doing for 2 years. I agreed to everything. Yes, the realtor could come by. Yes, they could help clear things out. Yes, Eric could look through James's business papers and handle whatever needed handling. I watched my son's face as he relaxed, watched Natalie smile into her wine glass, and I thought about Cooper in the next room. About James training that dog for months, knowing his son was robbing him, too sick to fight, but determined to protect me. They stayed until almost 9, making plans for my future. Their future, really. The one funded by money they'd stolen and secured by a dog they thought was dead. When they finally left, Natalie hugged me at the door. She whispered that I was doing the right thing, that this would all work out for the best. I closed the door behind them and stood in the hallway, listening to their car pull away. Then I opened the study door. Cooper walked out, stretched, and sat at my feet. I called Martin, told him they'd taken the bait completely. Natalie had even referenced Cooper's death, confirmed it to my face while I was being recorded. Martin's response was brief, but satisfied. He said we had everything we needed now. Time to stop playing defense. I looked at Cooper, at his patient brown eyes and graying muzzle, and remembered what James had written in his letter. Protect yourself. I'd done more than that. I'd let them think they'd won. I'd given them enough rope to hang themselves. Now it was time to pull it tight. The Monday after that dinner, Martin filed a police report. Not a civil complaint, a criminal report with the fraud division. He walked in with a banker's box full of evidence. James's documentation, the forged signatures, 2 years of unauthorized transfers totaling $160,000. The detective assigned to the case was a woman in her early 40s named Sarah Chen. Martin knew her from previous cases and trusted her completely. She called me that same afternoon and asked me to come to the station. I'd spent 34 years as a tax attorney. I'd dealt with IRS audits, forensic accountants, complex fraud cases. But sitting across from Detective Chen in that windowless interview room, I felt every one of my 73 years. This wasn't a client's problem I could solve with paperwork and billable hours. This was my son. Detective Chen reviewed the evidence with methodical precision. She asked about Eric's access to James's accounts, about the timeline of the transfers, about whether James had confronted Eric before he died. I told her everything, my voice steady even when talking about the months of caregiving while my son was systematically robbing us. Then she asked about Cooper. I explained what Natalie had told me, what I'd discovered, where Patricia's investigation had led. Detective Chen's expression shifted from professional interest to something harder. She told me animal cruelty cases were difficult to prosecute on their own, but combined with the financial fraud and the attempted destruction of evidence, we had something substantial. She wanted to talk to Dennis Kowalski personally and get his statement on record. 2 days later, she drove to Dennis's kennels with Patricia. Dennis cooperated fully. He'd kept the intake form Natalie signed. She'd used the name Nancy Wilson, but Dennis had security camera footage showing her car, her face, everything. He described the condition Cooper was in when dropped off, healthy and well-groomed. He admitted keeping the dog in the shed rather than euthanizing him immediately, thinking he might resell him. Detective Chen didn't charge Dennis. His cooperation was worth more than prosecution for running a questionable kennel operation. Besides, in a strange way, his hesitation had saved Cooper's life. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Detective Chen got warrants for Eric and Natalie's bank accounts, showing exactly where the stolen money had gone. New car for Natalie, a BMW she'd bought 8 months ago, home renovations, a vacation to Turks and Caicos while James was in hospice. They'd spent my husband's money while he was dying. Martin simultaneously filed civil suit for the full amount plus damages. He included a detailed accounting of every forged signature, every unauthorized transfer, every lie Eric had told about the firm's finances. The civil suit named both Eric and Natalie as defendants. But the part that felt most important to me was Patricia's additional investigation into the timeline. She reconstructed Cooper's journey from Dennis's kennels back to our house, 43 miles through rural Maryland, probably traveling at night when it was safer, drinking from creeks, avoiding roads. It had taken him 7 days to make it back, maybe 8. Patricia talked to people along the route. A farmer who'd seen a golden retriever on his property 3 days after Cooper escaped. A gas station attendant who'd left food out for a stray dog. Cooper had survived on kindness from strangers and pure determination. When Patricia showed me the map she'd created, tracking Cooper's probable path, I cried for the first time since finding him in the garden. That dog had traveled through woods, across highways, through terrain that should have been impossible for a 9-year-old retriever. And he'd done it because James had trained him, because some bond between man and dog transcended even death. Eric called me during the second week of the investigation. He wanted to know if his realtor friend could come by. His voice sounded nervous in a way I couldn't quite place. Not guilty, but anxious. As if something was making him uncomfortable, but he couldn't identify what. I told him I'd changed my mind about selling, that I wanted to wait, think about it more carefully. The house was my last connection to James. Eric's response was immediate and sharp. He reminded me I'd agreed, that I couldn't keep changing my mind, that the house was too much for me and I was being unreasonable. I'd never heard him speak to me that way before. Or maybe I had, and I'd excused it as stress, as his grief, as anything except what it actually was. Frustration that I wasn't cooperating with his timeline. I told him calmly that it was my house and my decision. Then I hung up. Martin called an hour later. Eric had contacted him, claiming to be worried about my mental state, suggesting I might be experiencing confusion or early dementia, asking if there were legal steps he could take to ensure I was making sound decisions. My son was trying to have me declared incompetent. Martin's voice was tight with anger when he told me. He'd shut Eric down immediately, explaining that I was his client and Eric had no standing. But the attempt itself was revealing. Eric was worried. Something had spooked him. Detective Chen figured out what it was. The firm's bank had flagged suspicious activity, standard fraud protection protocols. Someone had noticed the pattern of transfers and started asking questions. Eric had received a letter asking him to come in and discuss some discrepancies in the accounts. He knew the walls were closing in. He just didn't know I was the one who'd started pushing them. Patricia suggested we move quickly. Eric was in panic mode, which made him unpredictable. People who felt cornered did desperate things. But Martin wanted to wait for the forensic accounting report. The police had brought in a specialist to analyze every transaction, build an airtight case. Another week, Martin estimated. Maybe 2. I agreed to wait. I'd spent 10 days thinking Cooper was dead. I could spend 2 weeks watching Eric squirm. During those weeks, I kept my routine exactly the same. Grocery shopping on Wednesdays, garden work when weather permitted. Cooper stayed by my side always now, as if he understood his job wasn't finished yet. Natalie called once, her voice strained. She asked if everything was okay, if I'd talked to Eric. I assured her everything was fine and ended the call quickly. Let her wonder. Let her worry. The forensic accountant's report arrived on a Thursday, 47 pages documenting systematic theft. The accountant identified the exact moment the fraud began, 3 days after James's first cancer diagnosis. Eric had started small, testing whether anyone would notice. When no one did, he got bolder. Detective Chen called me in again. She wanted to prepare me for what came next. Arrest warrants, arraignment, the media attention. James's firm had been respected in the community. This would be news. I told her I understood. I'd been preparing for this since the moment I opened that metal box in my garden. She asked one more question. Was I certain I wanted to go through with prosecution? Once charges were filed, there was no taking them back. Eric was my son. This would destroy whatever relationship we had left. I looked at her across that sterile table and thought about James training Cooper in secret, too weak to confront his own son but determined to protect me. I thought about Natalie's hand on mine, assuring me Cooper's death was a blessing. I thought about Eric asking to be put in charge of my finances while he was already robbing me. I told Detective Chen to file the charges. Whatever relationship I'd thought I had with my son had been fiction for at least 2 years. Probably longer. I'd just been too trusting to see it. The warrants were issued on a Monday morning. Eric and Natalie were arrested separately. Eric at the firm's office, Natalie at their home. Both were charged with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and theft. Natalie also faced animal cruelty charges. Martin called to tell me it was done. They'd been booked, fingerprinted, and released on bail pending arraignment. I sat in my kitchen with Cooper at my feet and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief. Just a hollow certainty that I'd done what needed doing. James had trusted me to protect myself, to use the evidence he'd left, the dog he'd trained, the truth he'd documented. I wasn't going to let him down. The arraignment was scheduled for 3 weeks after the arrests. Martin warned me it would be brief, just a formality where they entered pleas and the judge set conditions. But he also warned me that Eric and Natalie would likely be there, that I'd have to see them. I told him I could handle it. What I wasn't prepared for was Eric's call the night before the arraignment. It came at 11 p.m., late enough that I was already in bed with Cooper stretched out on the floor beside me. The phone's ring shattered the quiet. Eric's voice was ragged. He said we needed to talk, that this had all gotten out of hand, that he could explain everything if I'd just listen. I asked him what there was to explain. The documents spoke for themselves. He started crying then. My 50-year-old son sobbing into the phone, telling me it wasn't supposed to happen this way, that he'd planned to pay it all back, that Dad was dying anyway and wouldn't need the money, and they were drowning in debt from Natalie's fertility treatments, and he just needed time to get ahead. James was dying anyway. as if that made theft acceptable. I asked about Cooper, about what Natalie had done. The line went silent for a long moment. Then Eric admitted he hadn't known about that until after. Natalie had told him she'd taken Cooper to a shelter, that I was too overwhelmed to care for a dog. He swore he didn't know she'd tried to have him destroyed. I wanted to believe that part. Some small piece of me wanted to think my son wasn't cruel, just weak and dishonest. But it didn't matter anymore. He'd stolen from his dying father and only felt guilty when he got caught. I told him we had nothing more to discuss. He begged me not to show up at the arraignment, said it would be easier for everyone if I stayed home, that seeing me would make it harder for him to get through this. I hung up without answering. The courthouse was exactly as I remembered from my years practicing law. Sterile hallways with fluorescent lighting, the smell of floor wax and stress. Martin met me at the entrance, Patricia beside him. They'd both offered to shield me from press if any showed up, but the local news hadn't caught wind yet. That would come later. Eric and Natalie arrived separately. She came first with her attorney, a sharp-dressed woman in her 40s who I recognized from the defense bar. Natalie's face was carefully blank, but I saw her hands shaking as she gripped her purse. Eric showed up 10 minutes later with a different lawyer, an older man I didn't know. That surprised me. They'd hired separate attorneys. Martin noticed it too and leaned close to whisper that separate representation meant their interests were diverging. One of them was preparing to throw the other under the bus. Inside the courtroom, I sat in the gallery while Martin joined the prosecution team at their table. Eric and Natalie sat on opposite sides of the defense section, not looking at each other. That told me everything. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s named Victoria Brennan. I'd appeared before her years ago and remembered her as fair but unforgiving of dishonesty. When she reviewed the charges, her expression grew progressively colder. Eric's lawyer entered a not guilty plea and requested reasonable bail conditions. Natalie's lawyer did the same, but added a motion to separate her case from Eric's, arguing that her involvement was minimal and she shouldn't be tried alongside the primary perpetrator. Primary perpetrator. She was already distancing herself. Judge Brennan set bail at $50,000 each, ordered them to surrender passports, and scheduled a preliminary hearing for 6 weeks out. Then she looked directly at Eric. She noted that the victim of these crimes had been his terminally ill father, that the theft had occurred over 2 years while the victim was incapacitated and unable to defend himself, that this showed a level of premeditation and callousness the court found deeply troubling. Eric's face crumbled. His lawyer touched his arm, probably warning him to show no reaction, but the damage was done. Judge Brennan had already formed an opinion. The hearing lasted 20 minutes. Afterward, in the hallway, I watched Eric and Natalie have what looked like an intense argument near the elevators. Her lawyer pulled her away. His lawyer pulled him in the opposite direction. Patricia had been watching too. She observed that their alliance was fracturing fast, noting that Natalie's attorney was smart to separate the cases. The animal cruelty charge was all hers, but the financial fraud was primarily Eric's. If Natalie could argue she'd been unaware of the extent of his theft, she might get a lighter sentence. Martin agreed. He predicted Natalie would flip, offer testimony against Eric in exchange for a plea deal. It was the logical move. We were proven right within a week. Natalie's attorney reached out to the prosecutor's office. Natalie was willing to provide detailed testimony about Eric's activities in exchange for reduced charges. She claimed she'd discovered the theft only months ago, that Eric had told her James had given him permission to manage the accounts, that she hadn't understood the transfers were unauthorized. It was a lie. The paper trail showed she'd been involved in spending the money, but it was a strategic lie. And the prosecutor was interested because Natalie could provide something the documents couldn't: motive and intent. She told investigators that Eric had become obsessed with his inheritance, that he resented having to wait for James to die to receive anything, that the fertility treatments had been expensive, yes, but Eric had also been furious that James planned to leave the house to me outright rather than splitting it with Eric immediately. According to Natalie, Eric had said more than once that James was wasting money on medical treatments that wouldn't work anyway, that the money should go to family who could actually use it. My son had wanted his father to die faster. Martin showed me the transcript of Natalie's statement. He asked if I was okay before handing it over. I told him I needed to read it regardless of how I felt. Seeing it in black and white, Eric's resentment, his calculations, his cold assessment of his father's worth versus his inconvenience, broke something in me I'd been holding together through sheer will, but it also clarified things. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake compounded by panic. This was who Eric had become, maybe who he'd always been underneath the dutiful son performance. The statement also addressed Cooper. Natalie admitted she'd taken the dog to Dennis's kennels, but claimed Eric had suggested it. He'd been worried the dog knew something, she said, that James had trained Cooper in his final months, and Eric didn't trust what the dog might reveal. That part I wasn't sure I believed. It sounded like Natalie covering her own cruelty. But it didn't matter. Whether Eric ordered it or Natalie acted alone, they'd both wanted Cooper gone. Eric's lawyer filed a motion challenging Natalie's credibility, arguing she was fabricating testimony to save herself. The motion included their text messages from before the arrests. One exchange from 2 months before James died stood out. Natalie had texted Eric asking when they'd finally be able to afford the house renovations they wanted. Eric had responded that it wouldn't be long now, that his father was declining fast and they just needed to be patient a little longer. Patient, waiting for James to die so they could access money they were already stealing. Martin filed the texts as additional evidence. They destroyed any remaining sympathy Eric might have generated. The preliminary hearing became a formality. With Natalie's testimony and the documented evidence, the judge found probable cause for trial. Both cases were bound over to circuit court, though Natalie's attorney immediately began plea negotiations. Through all of this, I maintained my routine: garden work, grocery shopping, sitting with Cooper in the evening. People at the grocery store had started recognizing me from the local news coverage that finally broke. Some offered sympathy, others just stared. I didn't care about their opinions. I cared about the truth coming out, about James's final act of protection being honored, about Cooper's impossible journey meaning something. 6 weeks after the arraignment, Natalie accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud and 1 count of animal cruelty. In exchange for her testimony against Eric, she received 2 years in prison with possibility of early release. Her sentencing hearing was brief. Judge Brennan noted that Natalie had cooperated with the investigation, but had still participated in crimes against a dying man and attempted to destroy evidence by abandoning his dog. The judge called it cowardly and calculated. Natalie cried through the entire hearing. I felt nothing watching her. Eric's trial was set for 3 months out. His lawyer tried one more time to approach Martin about a plea, but the terms were impossible. Eric wanted probation and restitution, but no jail time. The prosecutor refused. This was going to trial. Martin asked if I was prepared to testify, to sit on the stand and describe watching James die while Eric was stealing from us, to talk about Cooper, about the training, about finding that box in the garden. I told him I'd been preparing my entire life for this. 34 years of practicing law had taught me how to present facts clearly and credibly. Now I'd do it for my husband, and for the dog who'd traveled 43 miles to make sure the truth didn't stay buried. The 3 months before Eric's trial felt both endless and too short. Martin wanted me prepared for everything: the defense's strategy, the cross-examination, the probability that Eric's attorney would try to paint me as a vindictive mother rather than a victim. We met twice a week in Martin's office, going over my testimony. He'd ask questions, then play devil's advocate, attacking my answers the way Eric's lawyer would. It was exhausting, but necessary. The defense's strategy became clear through pre-trial motions. Eric's attorney was arguing that James had given verbal permission for the transfers, that as a partner in the firm, Eric had legitimate access to accounts, and that any signatures were authorized even if the documentation was informal. They were betting everything on reasonable doubt. Martin's counter was simple. Show the jury the timeline. The transfers began 3 days after James's cancer diagnosis and increased as he got sicker. Show them the forged signatures, the shaky copies that looked nothing like James's actual hand even during his final weeks. Show them Eric's text messages about being patient while his father died, and show them Cooper. That was Martin's strategy for breaking through legal technicalities and reaching the jury's emotions. A dying man trains his dog to reveal truth after death. A son tries to eliminate that dog to hide his crimes. It was a story that transcended bank statements and signature analysis. Patricia spent those 3 months building a presentation. She'd mapped Cooper's entire journey, from our house to Dennis's kennels, the 7 days trapped in that shed, the 43-mile trek home. She'd interviewed the farmer who'd seen him, the gas station attendant who'd left food, even a trucker who'd nearly hit a golden retriever crossing Route 40 at dawn. The map she created showed Cooper's probable path, marked with dates and witness statements. It was powerful evidence of determination and loyalty. But it was Dennis Kowalski's testimony that Martin considered crucial. Dennis would explain what Natalie had asked him to do, how he'd kept Cooper instead, the condition the dog was in. He'd confirm that a healthy dog had been brought for disposal under false pretenses. The prosecution planned to call me last, after the financial evidence and after Dennis. They wanted the jury to hear the facts first, then hear from the widow who discovered everything because of a dog her husband had trained. Eric's lawyer tried to exclude Cooper from the courtroom. He filed a motion arguing that bringing a dog to trial was prejudicial, designed to manipulate jury emotions rather than present facts. Judge Brennan denied it. Cooper was material evidence, she ruled. The jury had a right to see him. 2 weeks before trial, Eric's lawyer made one final plea offer. Eric would plead guilty to reduced charges, misdemeanor fraud instead of felony theft, pay full restitution, and accept 5 years probation. No jail time. The prosecutor asked my opinion. Technically, it was the state's case, but they wanted to know if I'd accept that resolution. I thought about James training Cooper in secret, too sick to fight, but refusing to give up. I thought about those final months when I'd believed Eric was helping manage the firm while he was actually stealing everything he could. I thought about Natalie's hand on mine, calling Cooper's supposed death a blessing. I told the prosecutor no. This goes to trial. Martin warned me one last time about what trial would mean. Eric's lawyer would attack my character, suggest I was confused about James's wishes, imply that my grief had made me vindictive. They'd question whether James really trained Cooper or whether I'd fabricated that story. They'd make it ugly. I understood. I'd practiced law long enough to know how defense attorneys operated. But I also knew juries, and I knew that evidence doesn't lie, even when people do. The night before trial began, I sat in James's study with Cooper at my feet. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent I'd preserved by keeping his closet closed, except when I needed to feel close to him. I read his letter again, the one he'd buried with the evidence. His shaky handwriting, his instructions, his final act of love disguised as legal preparation. Cooper rested his head on my knee, and I wondered if dogs understood justice. If he knew that his impossible journey had led to this moment. Tomorrow, we'd walk into that courtroom together. Tomorrow, James's final message would be heard. And tomorrow, my son would face what he'd done. I was ready. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, though I'd testified in dozens of them during my career. Something about being the victim rather than the attorney changed the perspective. The walls felt closer. The jury box looked impossibly far away. Eric sat at the defense table in a dark suit, his face carefully composed into an expression I recognized from his childhood. The look he'd wear when caught doing something wrong, but not yet willing to admit it. His attorney, a man named Robert Carlson, whispered something to him as I entered. Eric's eyes met mine for just a second before he looked away. Cooper walked beside me, his service vest identifying him as evidence. Martin had gotten special permission for this. Judge Brennan had reviewed the request and approved it, noting that the dog's role in discovering the evidence was central to the case. The jury, 7 women, 5 men, ranging from their 30s to late 60s, watched Cooper with visible interest. One older woman in the back row smiled slightly when he settled at my feet in the gallery. The prosecution opened with the financial evidence. An IRS forensic accountant walked the jury through every transfer, every forged signature, every unauthorized withdrawal. The numbers were damning. $160,000 over 23 months. The timeline was worse, beginning 3 days after James's diagnosis and accelerating as he declined. Eric's BMW purchase, the Turks and Caicos vacation, kitchen renovations, all funded by money stolen from a dying man. Carlson's cross-examination tried to establish that Eric had legitimate access to the accounts as a junior partner in James's firm. The accountant calmly explained the difference between authorized access and authorized use, between business expenses and personal enrichment. The jury took notes. The second day brought Dennis Kowalski to the stand. He was nervous, a rural kennel operator unused to courtroom formality, but his testimony was clear. A woman matching Natalie's description had brought in a healthy golden retriever, claimed the dog was sick and needed disposal, paid cash under a false name, and left. The prosecutor showed security footage from Dennis's property. There was Natalie's car. There was Natalie carrying Cooper inside. The timestamp was 3 days after James's funeral, exactly when she'd told me she'd taken him to the vet. Dennis described keeping Cooper in the shed, the inadequate conditions, the dog's eventual escape. He admitted his own wrongdoing without hesitation. The prosecutor asked why he hadn't euthanized Cooper as paid to do. Dennis looked at the jury and said the dog was too healthy, too vital. Something felt wrong about the whole situation. So he'd waited, thinking he'd figure out what to do. Before he could decide, Cooper had escaped and disappeared. Carlson's cross-examination tried to paint Dennis as an unreliable witness, a man who ran a questionable operation and admitted to taking money under false pretenses. But Dennis's simple honesty undercut the attack. He'd done wrong and admitted it. What had Natalie done? Patricia testified on day 3, presenting Cooper's journey. The map she'd created showed on the courtroom screens 43 miles through rural Maryland, 7 days of travel, witnesses along the route. The trucker who'd nearly hit him on Route 40 testified briefly, describing a golden retriever running at dawn, determined and focused. The defense tried to argue this was speculation, that no one could prove Cooper's route. Patricia calmly explained tracking methodology, probability analysis, witness consistency. The jury watched the presentation with complete attention. Then it was my turn. Martin led me through the timeline gently. Meeting James in 1978. 47 years of marriage, his cancer diagnosis, the months of caregiving, Eric and Natalie's presence during that final period. I described James's love for Cooper, how the dog had been his constant companion through treatment. I explained Natalie's complaints, her announcement, my devastation at losing both James and his dog within weeks. Then I described that Thursday morning, finding Cooper in the garden, his frantic digging, the metal box buried beneath James's roses. Martin entered the letter as evidence, James's handwriting, shaky but clear, his instructions about the flash drive, his warning not to trust Eric with finances, his final message, protect yourself. The courtroom was absolutely silent as I read it aloud. I explained how James had trained Cooper during his final months, using the last of his strength to ensure I'd find the truth. How he'd buried evidence and trained his dog to reveal it because he knew his son was stealing but was too weak to fight. Martin asked the crucial question, why would James go to such lengths? I looked at the jury and told them the truth. Because James knew he was dying and couldn't protect me himself. Because he'd discovered his son was a thief but didn't have the strength to confront him. Because he loved me enough to plan for justice even after death. Carlson's cross-examination was aggressive. He suggested I'd fabricated the training story, that James's letter was vague and could mean anything, that I was a bitter widow looking for someone to blame for my loss. I met every question calmly. I'd been a tax attorney for 34 years. I knew how to handle hostile examination. Carlson asked if I'd considered that Eric might have made mistakes rather than committed crimes. If family disputes over money were really worth destroying a relationship with my only child. I looked at Eric then, really looked at him. And I told the courtroom that my son had stolen from his dying father, had tried to eliminate evidence by destroying his father's dog, and had shown no remorse until he was caught. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a crime. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman was the older woman who'd smiled at Cooper on the first day. She read the verdict without emotion. Guilty on all counts: fraud, forgery, grand theft, conspiracy. Eric's face went white. His lawyer touched his arm but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Judge Brennan set sentencing for 3 weeks out, but addressed Eric immediately. She noted that he'd betrayed a dying man's trust, stolen from his own father during his most vulnerable moments, and attempted to destroy evidence. The breach of familial duty was staggering. Eric finally spoke, turning to look at me. He said he was sorry, that he'd never meant for any of this to happen, that he'd made terrible mistakes. I sat silent with Cooper at my feet, and I thought about James planting roses and truth in equal measure, about a dog who'd traveled impossible distance to fulfill a promise. Sorry wasn't enough. It had never been enough. 3 weeks later, Judge Brennan's courtroom was packed for sentencing. Local media had picked up the story. The dying man who trained his dog to expose his son's crimes made for compelling headlines. I'd declined all interview requests. This wasn't about publicity. It was about justice. Eric stood before the judge, his lawyer beside him. He'd lost weight during the trial, his suit hanging loose on his frame. Part of me, some small, stubborn piece of the mother I'd been, felt sympathy. Then I remembered James's shaking hands writing that letter, too weak to confront his own son, and the sympathy evaporated. Judge Brennan reviewed the case systematically. The $160,000 stolen over 23 months. The forged signatures, dozens of them. The timing that showed deliberate exploitation of a dying man's vulnerability. The text messages revealing Eric had been waiting for his father to die so he could access more. Then she addressed what she called the most disturbing element, the attempted elimination of Cooper. She noted that Eric had known James was training the dog, had suspected the dog might lead to evidence, and had either ordered or allowed Natalie to dispose of him. Whether Eric directed it or simply failed to stop it, he bore responsibility. The sentence was harsh but fair: 5 years in state prison, full restitution of $160,000 plus interest, permanent restraining order preventing any contact with me, and something I hadn't expected: mandatory enrollment in a rehabilitation program addressing financial crimes and family exploitation. Eric's lawyer requested leniency based on his client's lack of prior criminal record. Judge Brennan responded that this wasn't a momentary lapse. It was sustained, calculated theft from a dying family member. The betrayal of trust was profound. Eric was given 30 days to settle his affairs before reporting to prison. He turned to look at me as the bailiff approached. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but no words came. What could he possibly say that would matter now? I left the courtroom with Martin and Patricia, Cooper walking steadily beside me. Outside, reporters called questions I didn't answer. This had never been about my story becoming public entertainment. It was about honoring what James had done to protect me. Natalie had been released 2 weeks earlier after serving 18 months of her 2-year sentence. She'd divorced Eric while he awaited trial, moved to Delaware, and changed her name. Patricia had tracked her to a rental apartment outside Wilmington, working retail under her maiden name. I had no interest in what became of her. The restitution came through in stages. Eric's lawyer liquidated assets. The BMW sold at loss. The house Eric and Natalie had owned, bought in better times. Eric's share of James's firm, which I'd bought out through the civil judgment. Combined with wage garnishment that would follow him after prison, I eventually recovered every dollar. Not that the money mattered compared to what had been lost. I used part of it to establish a foundation in James's name, focusing on elder financial abuse prevention and legal aid for seniors. James had spent 40 years as an engineer solving problems. This felt like an appropriate legacy, solving the problem that had nearly destroyed us. The firm itself I sold to James's former partner, Marcus Webb, who'd been devastated to learn about Eric's theft. Marcus offered me fair value and promised to maintain the ethical standards James had built. I attended the closing, signed the papers, and walked away from that chapter completely. Dennis Kowalski's kennel was shut down by the county 6 months after trial. I learned about it from Patricia and felt no satisfaction. Dennis had saved Cooper's life, however accidentally. I sent him a letter thanking him for that hesitation, for keeping a healthy dog alive when he could have simply followed through. He wrote back saying my letter meant more than I knew, that he'd been carrying guilt about his operation for years. He'd started volunteering at a legitimate animal rescue now, trying to do better. My relationship with Cooper deepened into something I can't fully articulate. He was 10 years old when James died, 11 now. His muzzle had gone completely gray, his gait slower on cold mornings. But every day we walked to the garden together, to the roses James had planted. Cooper would sniff around the spot where we dug up the truth, then settle in the grass while I tended the flowers. People asked if I was lonely in the house by myself. The question always felt off base. I wasn't by myself. I had Cooper, the companion James had left me. I had James's presence in every room we'd shared for decades. I had the peace of knowing I'd honored his final wishes. I did make one new connection. Martha Rodriguez, a widow I met at the Elder Law Foundation's first fundraising event. She was 78, had lost her husband to Alzheimer's 2 years prior, and had faced her own battle with a nephew who'd tried to exploit her husband's confusion. We understood each other without extensive explanation. She had a terrier named Biscuit who got along well with Cooper. We started having coffee together weekly. The garden became my sanctuary. I spent hours there, especially in spring when James's roses bloomed. I'd added new varieties, yellows and pinks alongside his deep reds. Cooper would doze in the shade while I worked, and I'd talk to James the way I had when he was alive, telling him about the foundation, about Cooper's health, about the strange peace that had settled over my life after the chaos. On the first anniversary of finding Cooper in the garden, I invited Martin and Patricia for dinner. We sat on the back patio as evening fell, Cooper at my feet, and I thanked them for everything they'd done. Martin said he'd just been doing his job. Patricia said the same. But I knew better. They'd believed me when others might have dismissed an old woman's story about a trained dog revealing buried evidence. They'd fought for justice when it would have been easier to encourage a quiet settlement. Eric sent letters from prison. I returned them unopened. Martin advised me that I had no obligation to maintain contact, and I exercised that right. Whatever relationship we'd had ended the moment he chose theft over integrity. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive. Cooper is 12 now. We've had 2 more years together than I dared hope for after finding him that morning. The vet says his heart is strong, but suggests I prepare for the inevitable. Dogs don't live forever, even dogs who perform miracles. When that day comes, I'll bury him in the garden beside James's roses, where he dug up truth and changed everything. I'll make sure his grave marker tells his story, the golden retriever who traveled 43 miles home, who couldn't speak but revealed everything, who was my husband's final gift to me. People sometimes ask if I've forgiven Eric. The question misunderstands what happened. This wasn't about anger or forgiveness. It was about truth and consequences, about protecting what James built and honoring what he sacrificed to save me. I'm 75 now. My knee finally got that replacement surgery. I walk slower than I used to, but so does Cooper, so we match our pace. The house James and I built our life in remains exactly that. My life, my home, my peace. I learned something in these years I wish I'd known earlier. Loyalty isn't measured in words or blood. It's measured in actions, in sacrifice, in the quiet determination to do right even when no one's watching. James showed me that in how he prepared for his death. Cooper showed me that in his impossible journey home. And I showed myself that at 73, I could still fight when necessary, could still stand firm when everything tried to knock me down. They thought Cooper was just a dog, and I was just a grieving widow. They were wrong on both counts. If you've made it this far in the story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Because this story about truth, loyalty, and justice belongs to anyone who's ever had to fight for what's right. Cooper and I thank you for listening.